movies. I've watched movies all my life. But when I came to Beth Yeshurun some 24 years ago, I found myself in a job that didn't really afford me the opportunity to watch movies the same way I always had. Just didn't seem to have the time. My hours were rather infinite. And my wife, Marcy, started to get a little worried about me. She said, you need to find something to do with yourself that can take your mind off your work, give you some leisure. Why don't you start watching movies? I told her we can't go to the movies. By the time I finish at night, it's too late. And then, coincidentally, I was reading the Sunday Houston Chronicle. There were ads for a store named Circuit City, Alava Shalom, that was advertising these new big screen TVs. And I said to my wife, why don't we buy one of these things and we could sit together at night whenever we have the time and we can watch a movie. So began my renewal of a love for movies. And I subscribed to Netflix. Netflix originally was DVDs, so it's like Blockbuster by mail. But the nice thing about Netflix was back then, it let me pick any movie in print and get it delivered to my house. So I could try all kinds of interesting new genres. And one of those genres was watching films about Jews, films that describe Jewish life, Jewish history. These are not the films that were typically shown on television. They weren't even in the local Blockbuster stores. But they opened my eyes and gave me an opportunity to appreciate that we Jews have played a role in cinema for a long time. I could come up with 30, 40, 50 films that I would recommend. But today I want to suggest to you just a half dozen or so that I think every Jew should see. And even more importantly, I think our children should see them. Because many of our kids don't have a grasp of what Jewish life was like before they were born. Of course, they don't watch the movies. They only know from conversations with grandparents, perhaps, what Jewish life was. They've been spared so much of the sorrow and pain of being Jewish, which is a blessing. And yet these films, I think, can give all of us a renewed appreciation for how far we've come, and yet the challenges that still face us in living every day. And so let me suggest some favorites of mine and films I think are really worthwhile. The first one I want to start with is a film I think many of you saw, but probably haven't seen for many years. It was released in 1947, just 2 years after World War II. Interesting timing. But what makes this film particularly interesting is the subject matter and that this film won an Academy Award for Best Film. Gentleman's Agreement. It's a story about anti-Semitism in America, in post-war America. Jews fought side by side with men and women of various religious persuasions during the Second World War. But there was always an undercurrent of anti-Semitism, even in the ranks. For Jews who came back to the United States to start their lives anew, fresh, there were many opportunities to go into business, to go into retail, to go into manufacturing. And yet there was no question that in 1947, there was still latent anti-Semitism. And some of it wasn't even latent. If you had a passion for engineering and wanted to go into the oil business, you would find there'd be very few doors open to you. I had a friend in school back then. This is after I was already 6, 7 years old. This is almost a decade after 1947. He was a friend whose father was in the oil business, and they had a little ranch outside of Houston in Conroe. And he invited me to come spend weekends with the family several times, then stopped. And I asked him once, why did I not get invited anymore? And he said, well, my father says you're Jewish. His father was anti-Semitic. He was very nice to me, but he just didn't want me around, and he didn't want me playing with his son. Anti-Semitism continues to lurk in the world today. It takes many different forms. We don't hear so much about Jews, except from those very right-wing crazies. But we hear a lot of anti-Semitism expressed through anti-Zionism, through hatred of Israel, through all kinds of little subtle jabs that are taken at us sometimes in ignorance, but sometimes to make a point. Gentleman's Agreement is the story about a reporter, not Jewish, who decides he wants to explore if anti-Semitism is really all that it's made out to be. And so in this film, he pretends he's Jewish, goes out into the world, and discovers for himself what being Jewish really meant in post-war America. With me today is Jennifer Rosenzweig, who was the program director at Beth Yeshurun, and she's going to push the buttons that are going to enable us to watch the trailer for Gentleman's Agreement. All right, I'm sorry we didn't have audio on that. Let's hope we're more successful with the trailers that follow. I think the thing I would take from Gentleman's Agreement today is that too many of our kids are reluctant to stand up when they hear things that are said about Jews, when things happen that impact and affect Jews. They're very quick to be very reactive to offenses committed against others. I played a scenario once with my high school seniors, and I asked them, what would happen if you were a student on campus and somebody came to the campus and began speaking very racist kinds of language, talking about Blacks, African Americans, talking about Native Americans? What would be your response to having a speaker like that come on campus? And almost to a person, every student in my class raised their hand and said that they would fight against that. They would not allow that. That's shameful behavior, which should not be tolerated on a university campus. But when I raised the possibility of somebody like Louis Farrakhan, who is a noted anti-Semite, who's been invited to many campuses, if he was invited to come to the University of Texas and speak about his views, the students were mixed. Some of them said to me that they know of Louis Farrakhan, and he's doing a lot of good work for African-American youth. And even though he might say some things about Jews, that's free speech. People are allowed to say what they feel. That's part of what makes a university great. And I pointed my finger at them and said, how can you justify a difference between a speaker who's racist, otherwise bigoted, and a speaker who is also racist and otherwise bigoted, but is talking about Jews? Is there a difference that would make you feel you should oppose one and sort of let the other slip by? Our kids, many of them don't appreciate that being Jewish is also sometimes a difficult place to be, even in a country that offers all the freedoms and experiences that we take for granted. Gentleman's Agreement speaks of a time that was back in the 40s, but it also, I think, sometimes speaks of today as well. Gentleman's Agreement can be found on Amazon Prime. You can rent it for a couple of bucks. It's also on iTunes, again, for just a few dollars to rent. You can also buy it on DVD. Or if you can find it somewhere to rent it there, rent it on DVD as well. Our second film today is The Ten Commandments, which was in 1956. I know everybody has seen Ten Commandments. Some of you have seen it multiple times. I know I have. And yet, this is a film that I could not help but include because I think it's one of the best 6 Jewish films ever made. Now, really, is it a Jewish film? It's as much a Christian film because Christians, of course, accept the Old Testament and especially the biblical stories from the Old Testament as opposed to the laws. But it is nonetheless, I think, a very Jewish film because it comes to the very core of what Jews value, Jewish history teaches, the founding of our faith. The celebration of our great holidays all revolve around episodes that are discovered and displayed in the movie The Ten Commandments. Pharaoh versus Moses, the burning bush, the plagues, the Exodus, the splitting of the sea, the revelation at Mount Sinai. Those are the themes that connect Passover, Sukkot, Shavuot. Even when we recite the Kiddush every Friday night, Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, we remember our exodus from Egypt. The Ten Commandments is a way for us to go back and to see visually what we have read so many times from the Torah, from books. It's a very powerful film even today. Let's see if we have better luck with the trailer for the Ten Commandments.
Unforgettable films played on gigantic screens that overwhelmed the imagination. Now, that time has come again. Paramount Pictures proudly presents
Now you have to admit that's great. That is one heck of a movie. And even when you watch it now, it's not the same as watching it on a big theater screen, but on our big screen HD TVs, it still makes quite an impression. And I think it's important that we see films like this, understanding that the film is not exactly as it is described in the Torah. There are a few characterizations that are way off. There are characters that have a role in the film that don't appear in the Torah itself. But the film enables us to do something that reading sometimes is difficult to do, and that is to visualize. When we read, we visualize what we think is being said. When we actually see it in full life and color and majesty and pageantry, it makes a different kind of impression on us. And it makes a particularly powerful impression on our younger people who have not really read the Torah story at great length. They know the story in principle, but to see the foundation of Jewish life come to life, I think is a very powerful thing. And our kids need to see this, and we need to see it as well. And I don't think any of us who has ever seen it will ever forget when we first saw it. When Cecil B. DeMille came out behind a curtain at the very beginning, welcomed us to the theater for what was going to be the most spectacular thing we'd ever seen. And I think he delivered. Yes, it's got some cliches and it's a little corny in places, no question about it, but it is quite a film. And it's our story and one worth watching again and again. You can rent it on Amazon Prime. You can rent it on iTunes, and you can buy the DVD or the Blu-ray. And of course, every spring at Easter time, which coincides usually with Passover, of course, it usually shows on television. And you can see it again, though I don't recommend that particular presentation of it. 10 Commandments chopped up with commercials just doesn't cut it. Let's go to our next film. Our next film is one from 1959. It's The Diary of Anne Frank. Now, there have been numerous attempts to tell the story of Anne Frank on film, but the one I'm recommending is the 1959 edition, which was nominated for 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It's a second Jewish film that was brought to that level of public respect and attention. It won a couple of Academy Awards for Best Supporting Actress and Best Director. Now, one of the things it does for me is it tells us what it was like for Anne Frank to be living in this cloistered environment in a way that doesn't always come through even when you read the book. Let's remember, the book is a diary. The book tells us what thoughts were going through Anne Frank's head. It's her description of things, of her experiences and her thoughts, her wisdom, even at such a young age. But there's no pictures in the book, of course. There's no photographs to show us the environment in which she was sitting at her desk writing those words. The real impact of the movie is less the words that she wrote than the experience she had with her parents, with the friends, her family, who were all in this claustrophobic environment for so long. Some of us can appreciate a little more today what it is like to be locked in. But of course, what we are going through with the coronavirus today in 2020 can hardly be compared. We say in Hebrew, lahavdil, such a difference between what she experienced with her family in the annex in Amsterdam. But it's a powerful film. Some of you may have had the opportunity to go and to visit the house in which Anne Frank and her family lived during this period. And the first impression I had when I went there was as cloistered as I thought it was from watching the movie, and of course from my experience reading the book, to actually walk into that set of rooms and to see just how small they were, how confining they were, how little space there was to barely move, let alone live, just reinforced for me the power of the Diary of Anne Frank. And I think this movie in 1959 captured beautifully the heart and soul of this young girl and the terrible experience that she had in those horrific days. Let's watch the trailer for The Diary of Anne Frank. It's a wonderful film. I think it plays very well still today. There have been many other attempts to film the story of Anne Frank, both for television, movies, and for theatrical films. The chief criticism of the movie at the time was that it downplayed her Jewishness. But it should be fair and note that the book really was not a book about her being Jewish. It was about her thoughts about life, and being Jewish was part of it. But she really was writing more about her day-to-day experiences. She was writing more about her arguments with family, her difficulties with some of the people in which she was living, and some of her great wisdom, even for a young girl at that time. I think it's a wonderful film. It's available on DVD, but you'll have to go, let's see, it's on Amazon Prime, it's on iTunes, and it is on DVD. The next film we want to look at is one of my favorites, really, favorites among my favorites, and that is Exodus. It's a film that was made in 1960. It was a very fast response to a best-selling novel that was written 2 years earlier by a rather unnotable writer named Leon Uris. He was not highly regarded for his writing style, had not enjoyed great success, but he was very fascinated on a personal level by what had been happening in the land of Israel with the creation of the new Jewish state in 1948. So now, some 10 years later, he wrote a novel which tried to capture the power and emotion of the founding of the state of Israel. The book became an international bestseller. I'll tell you how big a bestseller it was, that years later, when we had the Soviet Jewry movement, when there were hundreds of thousands of Jews living in the former Soviet Union who were struggling to express themselves Jewishly, to enjoy freedom of religion, and given an opportunity, hopefully, to go to Israel or to the United States, there were two things that they asked people to bring to them who came from the United States and the West. We have an ambulance out here. Sorry for the noise. Hope everybody's okay out there. Here it's coming. And hope everything's okay, of course. My goodness. Oh my. Okay. Hope everything's okay. We were asked to smuggle into the Soviet Union Jewish calendars and copies of Leon Uris's novel, Exodus. It's a great story, and let's look at the trailer. Blockbuster of the year. Dazzling, mind-filling, nerve-tingling, rips the heart. Managed to have at Concord the day they fired the shot heard around the world. Time magazine says, a terrific show. A serious, expert, frightening, and inspiring thriller. You heard what I said?
Oh, God, why'd you keep doing that?
Fight! Look back! Fight! Exodus. The Chicago Tribune says a tremendous picture. The Los Angeles Examiner says terrific impact and fury. The Dallas Herald says a superb candidate for the Hall of Screen Greats. The Boston Traveler says magnificent. The Miami Beach Sun says stands head and shoulders above all others. The Cleveland Plain Dealer says one of the great films of all time. Exodus. Well, does that stir you up? It's quite a film. As a matter of fact, the New York Times, when it reviewed the film, called it, and I'm quoting, a dazzling, eye-filling, nerve-tingling display of a wide variety of individual and mass reactions to awesome challenges, and in some of its sharpest personal details, a fine reflection of experience that rips the heart. That's the last positive review the New York Times ever gave to a film, I think. But this is really a stunning review. And there's so much more that can be said about the film, even though there's no question that in today's eyes, it can seem a little corny at times and a little preachy at times. And that is for sure. There are numerous times throughout the story when somebody will stand up and make a sentence or two statement to explain why we are doing this, or why we are fighting the British, or why we are fighting the Arabs, or somebody has to stand and tell us and give us a little history, a little paragraph about it all began back in 1929, just because the story is so massive, it's so sweeping, that if you just watch it straight on and have no idea of the history of how the Jewish people got to that place in Jewish history, then you may feel, what's going on here? I don't really understand the context. And so some of that may seem a little bit off-putting, but the truth of the matter is, even those scenes aren't bad, but they're necessary, I suppose. And what we end up with is a story of Jewish pride and a reminder to us of just why we needed a state of Israel, all the rigors that went into founding the state, all the rejection that the Jewish people faced in the creation of the state. And I think we need that kind of historical perspective because those very questions are being asked still today, some 70 years later. What is it about the Jewish people that they are entitled to such a state, need such a state, have the right to fight for this state? Exodus gives us the foundation that so many of us have forgotten and lost. And some of us, like our children and grandchildren, never had. They look at the news, they see what Israel has done today, no context at all, no idea how long this struggle's been going on, no idea why Israel was created, no idea about the terrible challenges Israel has faced ever since. I think it's an important film to watch even today, and it's certainly worth watching on the biggest screen you can find. Leon Uris's Exodus can be bought on a DVD, but you'll have to go on eBay to find it. The movie is out of print. It's not to be found on any of the streaming services. It's simply unavailable. And you can still buy it, cheap copies, on eBay. All right, let's go to the next movie. Very different kind of film. This is a film that was released in 1990. It's called Avalon. I think Avalon is one of the best films to describe the Jewish experience in early American Jewish history. It's a story about a family that comes from Europe, from Poland, never explicitly defined as Jewish, described as Jewish, and yet there are intimations of the Jewishness of the family throughout the film. And there's no question that it has been interpreted to be a Jewish family, extended family, making its way in a new country in the new world. It's a multi-generational story. Grandfather, children, grandchildren, all coming to grips with the reality of what it is like to live as a Jew here in this time, in the early 19th century, early 20th century, forgive me. Okay. It's mostly an autobiographical story about a specific family, but it comes to talk about issues of assimilation and modernity. It's an amazing, beautiful, tender story about our grandparents and great-grandparents and the challenges they faced in deciding who is a Jew in a land where you are just starting out and establishing the rules in society for the role of Jews. Let's look at the trailer for Avalon, 1990.
I came to America in 1914. And then I came to Baltimore. It was the most beautiful place you've ever seen in your life.
Oh, Sam, how many times do we have to hear this story? The children know the story.
I'm telling them about when I came to America.
Yeah, we know about it. We all heard it before.
They shared a dream called America in a place called Avalon.
I think Avalon is one of my favorite films because it really tells a story that many of us lived through, even if we were born after the story timeline itself. Most of the film takes place in the 1940s, second generation. I was born in the 1950s, and I remember, for example, here living in Houston, that at Christmas time, we didn't say anything about the Christmas trees in our classrooms at Red Elementary School. And we had our Christmas pageant and the Jewish kids wanting to be welcomed into the larger community and showing that we are fellow classmates, even though we're Jewish. We participated in these pageants, but my mother told me that I could participate, but I couldn't sing the word Jesus. So I would have to go when it came time for a hymn to be sung. I had to show to myself remind myself that I was still Jewish, even though I was living in a friendly Jewish world. That was a struggle even in the 50s. This film describes the 30s and the 40s. I think we face it still today. We want to be welcomed and integrated and assimilated into modern society, and yet we still don't want that Jewish tradition, that heritage, that history to be lost. And we worry whether our children will continue to embrace the very values that we instilled in them when they were younger as they grow up, enjoy all the fruits and benefits of being an American, but at the same time, will they still remember the importance of being Jewish? Avalon raises these questions at the very beginning of our American Jewish experience in a way that is very poignant and beautiful. The next to last film, is a rough film. And I have to tell you that I was one of the last people to see Schindler's List, which surprised people in my congregation back in 1993, because everybody had seen Schindler's List. Everybody was talking about Schindler's List. The reviews were simply amazing. It was, from the very beginning, seen as one of the most outstanding films of the year, and for many years. It was Steven Spielberg's biggest, most important movie. Even though he'd made some wonderful other films, this one really had gravitas. This was heavy. This was major storytelling of a major historical event. It was like nothing he had ever made. And it pushed him to the very top. It was, of course, awarded with Best Picture Oscar. In 1993, I was one of the last to see the film because I didn't know if I had it in me to watch it. I have been reading about the Holocaust. I have been reading memoirs from the Holocaust. I've been reading histories of the Holocaust for many, many years. And I asked myself, do I need to sit through this film to be reminded of the horrors that took place in the camps back in the 1940s? I was finally convinced by a group of congregants in my congregation in Rhode Island, who said to me, Rabbi, enough. We're going to take you to see Schindler's List. And so I agreed, and I went. And I remember to this day, when I came out of the theater, I was in tears, as was everybody. And I remember thinking to myself, how could I have not seen this earlier? And secondly, everybody, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, needs to see this film. It was extraordinary, an extraordinary movie experience. It impacted me in a way that I never imagined it could or would, but it left a mark on me that has stayed with me many years later. I still highly, highly recommend this film. There's been some criticism of the film, primarily that Schindler is presented as someone who was more than he was in real life. He was much more of a rogue, historians say. And I had the opportunity to read the book, Schindler's List, before I saw the movie, and I already knew from the book there was a little more of a realistic spin on his life than was in the movie. But that has nothing to do with the power of the movie. The movie itself is a story of an imperfect man who rises to the occasion in his life, maybe for the only time in his life, to really do something life transforming. Let's be reminded of what Schindler's List brought to the screen by taking a look at the trailer.
sure it's not an accompanying business. I see that it had a certain panache. That's what I'm good at. Not the work, not the work. Presentation. Kielbasa sausage, cheeses, look caviar. And of course, who can live without German cigarettes? Yeah, as many as you can find. More fresh fruit. Real rarities, oranges, lemons, pineapples. Several boxes of Cuban cigars, the best. And dark unsweetened chocolate, not in the shape of ladyfingers. Chunk chocolate, big as my hand, to simplify it. 900, don't make it 10. For Wednesday, all this stuff here goes to mattresses factory. What's the worker? I expect to be compensated. He's on the list. Let's find him. Stern! 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 Ethan, Stern! Stop the train! Here! Stop the train! I woke up from a dream this morning. I was broke and sharing a room with 12 people I didn't know. What was done? Do you have any questions, sir? Yeah, I was top down. I'm fucking crazy. Every rack, carry that help back.
Schindler's List was a revelation to a great many people. People who thought they knew everything about the Holocaust, from books, even listening to speakers, were dumbstruck by the depth of pain they felt watching the film. And that is the power of movies. As I said earlier with regard to the Ten Commandments, you can't fully understand or even get close to fully understand. You can't fully understand unless you were there. But you get closer to it when you can see it. It's as if the camera was dropped into the camp. And when you saw the horrors played out, the inhumanity, that visual moment is what stays with you and then helps define everything you read and hear going forward. I had the opportunity to lead one of our Beth Yeshurun groups to Israel a number of years ago, and on the trip with us was a member, many of you remember, Leon Cooper. Leon was the father of our member Toby Cooper, whose husband is Rabbi Danny Horowitz. And Leon and his wife were with us, and he had asked before we left, could we please go to Israel and when we do see the grave of Oskar Schindler. So we went. It's right outside the old city. We had passed it many times on earlier trips. I never realized that it was actually right there. You walk across the street. When we came down to the grave of Oskar Schindler, it was covered with stones, people having left them there over the years, as we do in our own cemeteries, to acknowledge that Oskar was visited that day, and obviously had been visited many, many times. And as our guide gave us a wonderful story of Oskar Schindler and reminded us of what Schindler's List had come to teach us, Leon asked if he could spend just a moment and say a few words. He started talking about how he was alive that day because of Oskar Schindler, that Oskar Schindler had saved his life and saved the lives of so many others. And at one point, Leon actually fell onto the grave and began crying out, "Thank you, Mr. Schindler. Thank you, Mr. Schindler." There wasn't a dry eye there. Even our guide, who'd been there many times, began sobbing. The story of Oskar Schindler is the story of what might have been had there been more men like him. Germans, Europeans,
who had so many opportunities to stand up, to do something, to make a difference somewhere for some handful of people. We have the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, and we marvel at how many trees there are planted in memory of those who saved Jews during the war. But we are reminded as well of just how many more trees there should be and should have been. Schindler's List is a story that we should never forget. And as our children grow older and are able to comprehend and deal with the kinds of things the film so graphically illustrates, it's important for them to see this film too. And for us to be reminded constantly that this horrible event happened and that it still shapes so much of what Jews feel today and who we are as Jews in the modern world. The last film is a delightful film, and this is the film I suspect a great many of you have never seen. It's an Israeli film. Israel is turning out some very high quality films these days. Many of its earlier efforts were not particularly good. Even by Israeli standards, they weren't particularly well received. But in the last decade or so, there have been a number of films which have not only earned the respect of Israelis, but audiences throughout the world. And one of the first of this new level of quality in Israeli films is a film called Ushpizin. Ushpizin is a name that we use for the guests who visit us on Sukkot. If you've been to somebody's sukkah and you look on the wall, you'll often find on the wall this whole big thing about Ushpizin, and it tells us every night which of our patriarchs and matriarchs come to visit us in our sukkah. It's a whole little skit that is laid out for you to read when you come into your sukkah each night during the holiday of Sukkot. So we have a story here about this couple. They are what we call Balei Tshuva. They are a couple that wasn't ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox and became ultra-Orthodox. They live in Jerusalem, and they're very poor. And the man is kind of a shlamazel. He can't seem to make a break. He can't seem to get enough money to really take care of himself and his wife. They want to live in a bigger house. They want to have so many things that they really need, but just, there's no mazal. Surprisingly, he receives a gift, a check for some 1,000 shekels, which is a lot of money for him. It's $300. It's a lot of money for anybody. But what does he do? Rather than go out and get things that they need for their house or go and get something that will make their lives a little better, he goes and buys the most beautiful etrog that he can find to shake on Sukkot, lulav and etrog. He spends all the money, the 1,000 shekels on it. And of course, he's very proud. He's got this beautiful lulav and etrog set. And he's shown how much he reveres the commandment hidur mitzvah, which means we should make beautiful the mitzvah. We shouldn't just do a mitzvah. We should do it as well as we can. If it says to build a sukkah, we should build the nicest sukkah. We need to shake a lulav and etrog. We should shake the nicest one we can afford. Well, he really couldn't afford this one. But he bought it anyway. His wife was like, ay. But still. And so it's a story on one level of piety, perhaps a little foolishness as well. In the midst of all this, two visitors come and find their way to their sukkah. They are on the run. They're on the lam, as we say. And they've come to visit their old friend who used to be not so pious. And the intrusion of these two vagabonds on this Orthodox couple's Sukkot is what drives this film. It's both poignant, it's funny, it's a wonderful observation of life among the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. It's an opportunity for us to step into a world of which we know precious little who live outside it. And it gives us an opportunity to smile and to share the hardships and the blessings which come with being ultra-Orthodox, celebrating Sukkot when times are tough, and at the same time finding joy in being alive to celebrate a holiday yet again. Let's look at the trailer for Ushpizin.
are considered a blessing, these two unexpected visitors bring with them a secret from the past. A secret that will test their love and challenge their faith. Now, only a miracle will turn their fortunes around.
This is a wonderful picture, and I really urge you to see it. Again, I'm not surprised if you say to yourself, I've never heard of it, but it's certainly worth watching and acquiring. You can buy it on DVD. Amazon has it and others. You can rent it on Amazon Prime and on iTunes, and it's worth a few dollars to watch it or even to buy the DVD. I highly recommend it. There's an interesting aside to this, though. The film is about a Haredi couple, which means a very ultra-Orthodox couple in Israel. And Haredi Jews typically don't go to movies. They don't read secular newspapers, secular books, watch television. But when word got out about this film and the reviews were very positive, some in the ultra-Orthodox community found ways to watch it without actually going to the theater. As happens with so many films, there were bootleg copies that got circulated throughout the Haredi neighborhoods in Jerusalem and throughout Israel. And the producer was very concerned because so many bootleg copies were being circulated. They were losing the income from people actually going to the theater to watch it. And so what the producers decided to do was to put signs up all over the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Israel with a little pushki underneath the sign. And it says, "Thou shalt not steal. Please support Ushpizin by making a donation. If you want to give us a credit card number, call this number. Or at the least, make a reservation to watch the movie, pay for the ticket, and don't come if you don't want to be seen in the theater." In any kind of attempt that the producers could come up with to bring some of the money back from all the Haredim who would never admit to having ever watched a secular film, but wanted to see this one. Now, I recommend it legally. You can buy your own DVD copy of it. You can rent it on Amazon Prime and on iTunes. And I think it's a wonderful experience, and you'll enjoy it, and it will teach you something too. So those are just 6 of my favorite films in terms of Jewish life and living. There are many, many more, thanks to Netflix, Amazon Prime, and so many other ways in which we can watch films. We are able to really explore Jewish life and history through a great many ways. I hope you'll take advantage of all the time you have right now as we're all quarantined for the coronavirus to explore a little beyond whatever Netflix is just offering today. Brand new, maybe good, maybe not. Try to find other films of this kind. Look up Israeli films on Netflix or on Amazon Prime, and you'll be surprised by how many you see, how many you find. And you'll find some of the older films on YouTube, where many of them are free. It's been a pleasure being with you today. Thank you, Jennifer, once again for all of your help. And my best to everyone here, that you stay healthy, stay safe, and we'll all get through this together. Amen. Shalom, everybody.